All right, I guess I can tell I am being heard, right? Okay, sounds loud and clear. Stan is away today. He's had three straight weeks where we had to work on things. The last 2 weeks, if you were in here, we saw the screen. We actually taped the lesson. So I said to him, oh, I really want to be there today, and so he'll be back next week, and hopefully he and I'll be up here together. As you know, we're in the Gospel of Mark. We may not make it in the 3 months. It may take another week or two. We're not quite sure, but we're doing okay. But the idea was 3 months on Mark, 3 months on Matthew, 3 months on Luke, and 3 months on John's Gospel. That's the idea. But I told him, let's don't worry about it. Let's just try to do a thorough job on what we do, and then we can move on from there. So I'll get us started, and then I just told him I'd get as far as I could get. I try not to I have to be at some angle or not, that's why, so I don't mean to turn my back on you. I did move the table out of the way. But anyway, we're going to start with a couple of maps. Actually, we'll have a map, then a little bit later we'll have another map. It really helps to have the maps, like when Les had his map up there. And when you do this, you can see where we're going. And we're around the Sea of Galilee in the north. And all of the cities there, pretty much in the Bible, have been discovered except for the city of Bethsaida. There's a big argument about Bethsaida. There's down to 2 sites there, but we'll come back to that later. But it's important that you see that Bethsaida is on the Sea of Galilee. There was a view that for a long time that it was at a site a couple of miles away north, but it didn't make any sense. Now they've just about proven the actual site. It's a site called El Araj, and scholars are pretty well closed again, and they're actually doing excavations there. And the reason Bethsaida is important is because this is where Peter and Andrew came from. Now, when Jesus comes along, apparently Peter has moved to the city of Capernaum. But Peter and Andrew are from this city, and Philip is from this city. And this was a heavily Greek-speaking area. Just by looking at the 3 names I just gave you, Peter is the Greek form of Cephas. Andrew is a Greek name. Philip is a Greek name. Philip means lover of horses, from the Greek word phileo and the word hippos that run together, lover of horses. And so it's incredible. One of the things that we do in the New Testament archaeology class is we look at all the Greek that's taking place, all the city names. Philadelphia was the name of Amman Jordan. Well, there were many Philadelphias, 7 churches of Asia, etc. One in Pennsylvania, of course, named after those cities. And then the city of Amman Jordan was called Philadelphia at that time. It was only 40 miles east of Jerusalem. And so there was lots of Greek, and they were speaking some Aramaic, some Greek, especially in the land. And this was a heavily Greek-speaking area in this. And so we're going to be looking especially at Bethsaida. Capernaum is going to come into play again. And there's the famous Sea of Galilee, which is really Lake Galilee, but translations started saying sea, and so that's what happened. The Greek word really means a lake, Lake Galilee. Beautiful, beautiful place to go, and we always stay at one of the hotels in Tiberias. In my 22 trips there, we always stayed somewhere around Tiberias for 3 or 4 days. So this will help us as we're explaining what's going on here. So one of the first things that we have, and something that could take the whole 45 minutes. And by the way, I forgot my watch too. So Juanita, you and David, at 5 minutes to the hour. Don't feel embarrassed. They can't see you on the screen. hold up your hand, say 5 minutes. So don't hesitate to do that. Uh, but this whole first section is the section I told Stan, I said, we can spend a lot of time on this. This is one of the things. The Pharisees have come up from Jerusalem. And the Pharisees were a very strict Jewish sect that came out of the intertestamental period, out of the Maccabean period. And a lot of them were very sincere, a lot of good people involved that, but they were legalist to the nth degree. And Jesus is going to address that problem that they had. It's really easy for us to get caught up in traditions. I can remember, I just made a list, and it could take a whole page, but I can remember when you did not eat in the church building. You did not eat in the church building. We didn't have bathrooms in the church building. And I just made a whole list of things. I remember when all the ladies wore hats, on and on and on. So you could just list so many things. I remember when you would never bring a Christmas tree and put it in the building like we have. And the Pharisees had some of the same kind of problems. And I remember on my very first trip to Israel, the very first night, we stayed in a very, very Jewish hotel in Tel Aviv. I remember we got there on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. And we got ready to go to our room. And you go to the elevator, and I can't remember why the door would open, because you weren't allowed to push buttons. But someway or another, the door came open. And then you couldn't push floor 7 where we were. It went by itself, a floor at a time. Because if you pushed a button, you were working. You were doing some work on the Sabbath. And so we went to the 7th floor, a floor at a time. And I had no idea what was going on. Why we didn't just push, because there was a 7 there. We could just push 7, but it wouldn't have worked. And then later, when we started staying at not so Jewish hotels, they were Jewish hotels, but they weren't as Jewish. You had 2 elevators, and one elevator, you got on the Gentile elevator, and you could hit 7 and go to the 7th floor. But if you were a strict Jew, you got on the other elevator and went, or if it's 16 floors, you go stop at each floor, 16 floors. So I thought you might enjoy that story. Well, that's the kind of thing that they get caught up in. So here, these teachers of the law, and this is, I think, the second time it's mentioned, they come up. They're hearing all these things about Jesus, and they want to know, what's happening. And like it says there, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing. And that's what they did a lot. And a lot of it wasn't immersing, just your hands sometimes would be washed. And it was just based on some Old Testament laws that were there for health reasons, so you wouldn't be unhygienic. But they had turned those into part of the religion. And this is what Jesus is going to talk about here. Jesus is going to get kind of upset at them and is going to call them hypocrites. I think one Sunday morning I explained hypocrite there, maybe a while ago, but it's a Greek word that means one who play acts, an actor, one who acts like he's doing something. And so Jesus is saying, you actors, you just, and so our word hypocrite comes from that, and we have developed it had a positive and a negative meaning in ancient times, but Jesus uses it not on the stage, but you're out in life doing this. So actually, we could spend a lot more time talking about that. I think that probably I need to go back. It seems like I missed something there. Well, Corbin. I guess let me just stop and talk about Corbin. This will give you a real good illustration of what Jesus is talking about. The word Corbin is only used in chapter 7, the book of Acts. It appears 80 times in the Old Testament, 78 times in Leviticus and Numbers, especially in the part giving the law, and you kind of expect it in Leviticus, and twice in Ezekiel. And what the word actually means is from a verb that means to draw near, and was used to draw near to God a lot. And so this noun came to mean giving God an offering, a special offering, something devoted to him. And these Pharisees began using that not to help their parents. That is, well, I know you need some help, Mom and Dad, but this is devoted to God. We have to give it to God. And so Jesus is very, very upset about that. And so he quotes Exodus chapter 20, and where he says, honor your father and your mother. And he said, and so I brought along, let's see here, I brought along a little bit of the New Living Translation. It says, they noticed, these Pharisees have come down, they noticed that some of the disciples failed to follow the Jewish ritual of hand washing before eating. This is but one of the many traditions that they have clung to. And it goes on and explains that. Then it goes on and Jesus replies, you hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, for he wrote, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship to me is a farce. Ooh, that's a paraphrase. The New Living Translation is a paraphrase. But anyway, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God. And then he goes on and says, this is verse 9 of the New Living Translation. You skillfully sidestep God's law in order to hold on to your own tradition. And so he goes on to say, the parents need help, but sorry, I can't help you, for I vowed to give to God what I would have given to you. And so Jesus said, how ridiculous is that? You're violating God's law. So this is what this is all about. And I think this is so important that we always make sure that we separate. We just do not have a worship that turns out to be a farce there. Well, coming to another story, that's why this other map is here. And if you were in Israel, in the Near East today, you'd be looking at Lebanon, roughly speaking. So Phoenicia is in that same area right there, and you'll recognize Sidon and Tyre, or Tyre and Sidon we usually say. This is the area from which Jezebel came. This was a very heavy area of Baal worship. And it's just north of Mount Carmel. Those who have been to Israel, you can see that just above the eye on Israel there where the water dips in. That's where Mount Carmel ends as you're standing there looking over the city of Haifa. And then across the bay is the city of Akko, which became Ptolemais in New Testament times. So this is the area that Jesus is going to go in. He's going from Galilee, the area in Galilee, north of the Sea of Galilee, Caesarea Philippi, that area, and then he goes over, not terribly many miles, a long number, a big distance. And so it mentions that he runs across what our English translations say Syro-Phoenician. They could have just translated Phoenicia. You know, we call the whole area Syria, Palestine. And Syria is, of course, where Damascus is, where Lebanon is, etc. And so Jesus goes there. And it says this woman, most of the translations say, She was a Gentile. It literally says she was a Greek. And you have to keep in mind that we're talking, is what I started the lecture today. I started talking about Philip and Andrew, and Philip and Peter and Andrew's names. And the whole Eastern Mediterranean was a very, very strong Greek-speaking area, all the way from, of course, Greece to the Western Asia Minor, heavily Greek-speaking area. Paul grew up in a town where they spoke a heavy Greek there in Asia Minor, and then Tarsus, and then Antioch was a Greek-speaking city, Antioch of Syria, and then you go through Israel and get into Egypt, and the second largest city in the world was Alexandria, Greek-speaking city, founded by Alexandria. So it's a heavily Greek-speaking area. So when it says Greek, sometimes they had a word for Gentile, and Gentile is not used here. The word Greek is used here, meaning she was a Hellenist. She was a person, she was not Jewish, and a few Jews were. I believe that Luke was a doctor from Antioch, and he was a Hellenistic Jew. And a lot of people want to say he was a Gentile, but he was really a Hellenistic Jew. But in any case, he is there. And so here's contact Jesus has, as he sometimes has with Gentiles. So he has this contact. He's going to have contact in the early part of John's gospel with a Samaritan. Yet, as Les pointed out, when the gospel came, it went first to Jerusalem and heavily Jewish area. And a lot of people had come from the world who were Jewish, had come from all over the Mediterranean area to worship there. And then they go down to Samaria and present the gospel to them, and then finally up to Caesarea where Cornelius was and present the gospel. But Jesus has this contact with different Gentiles, Roman soldiers. A Roman soldier was not a Jewish soldier. There were some Jewish soldiers. When Jesus is in the garden praying and the soldiers come to get him, they come from the Castle Antonia there. A Roman cohort comes out of there, but they brought with them some temple policemen, and they would have been Jewish. But very few soldiers could be. There was a certain number of soldiers under the control of Herod and others, but usually the soldiers, when it talks about a Roman soldier, he is going to be somebody who's not Jewish. That would be very, very rare. So he has contact with this woman, and he is going to help her. And so anyway, I guess we put the traditions here. So anyway, he does help that woman, and we can't cover all the miracles in Mark and without saying it's all yours just to do that. But here, I guess, is where we put this. We had looked at this a couple of times this week. So I won't take a lot of time looking at this because I already mentioned it. But in Isaiah 29, Jesus quotes that also. And this is where he says, Isaiah, clearly prophesied what people oftentimes do. And they teach the doctrines of men as part of worship. And that's something, like I said a minute ago, we have to continually struggle with that and make sure that we don't do that. So that's what this whole section's about. Okay. This is when he gets into talking about their heart, about legalism. So go back to now. Anyway, so the Pharisees are troubled. His teaching is different than everybody else's. He doesn't teach like the lessons they have heard. Oftentimes, I remember when I first started teaching about Bible translations and what was going on in the different churches and in England. And what was happening was that the people were, first of all, the lessons were in Latin. And most of the average person couldn't read Latin. A lot of the scholars and a lot of the higher class did read Latin, and they could read the Vulgate, uh, and then they had Wycliffe's translation that was kind of rejected by the church because it was in English. But the sermons, when William Tyndale graduated from college and started living in a little town with Lord John and Lady Anne, these two people tutoring their children and preaching at the local church, he preached his sermons in English. And when you study the history of the English Bible and see the different translations develop, you see that along came the Great Bible, and they put the Bible in the church, but the preacher still got up and spoke in Latin. And people would come and pick up the Bible and go over to the corner and start reading in English, and the crowd would shift around to them. And the priest would complain to their bishop, "We can't get anything done. All the people want to do is read the Bible." And when people read for the first time, let's say, a story like the parable of the prodigal son, tears would roll down their cheeks because they'd never heard that story. They had been through rituals all the time, but they really never knew what was going on. And so that's one of the reasons that the church at that time wanted to keep the Bible away from common people. They had their plan. This is the way we do it. And Tyndale got in trouble for preaching in English and was called before a bishop saying, you're teaching the Bible in that vulgar language. And English was not a well-developed language at that time. But here we are blessed to look at many translations. And so anyway, the Pharisees who came up, they had their way of doing things. They were always fighting with the Sadducees about a lot of things also, and other sects. But they wanted to see what this man is saying. He's saying things differently than we're saying them. He's giving different interpretations. And Jesus was going right to the heart of Scripture and telling people how they ought to live. And so then, they're asking for a sign. And he knows they're just coming to criticize him. They're looking for ammunition. That's what happened a lot of times. They would send some high officials to listen to Tyndale or Wycliffe or someone like that. And the interesting thing in 1611, when the King James translation was made, if a person will just read the preface of the original King James, you go online and get it. You get it in better English because in the 1611 edition, I don't remember how many pages, about 24 pages in that edition, but it's in Old English and hard to read, but you can get a revised edition. But the translators said, don't let this be the last translation. Keep revising. Keep putting it in the language of the everyday person. And on and on and on and on. Keep going back to the Greek and the Hebrew and make it as clear as you can. This is the Word of God. It needs to be put in the language of the people. Well, here are Pharisees. They've got their own language. They've got their own religion. They're doing all these different things. They're big on ritual and all of that kind of thing. And they really have a hard time with Jesus, the things he's saying, and the fact that Jesus is working with the common person. And so they want a sign. Of course, if he get a sign, it's like in Wycliffe and Tyndale days, they would run back to the authorities. We got him. This is what he said. This is what he attempted to do. This is what he claimed. And so this is what's going on there. So Jesus refused to give them any kind of a sign at that time. And he gets in the boat. Remember, we're in the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. And as he's going, the disciples, they are still being in the training process. They're still learning from Jesus. And sometimes Jesus just shakes his head and because he tells them, to be aware of the leaven or the yeast, if you want to translate that, yeast of the Pharisees, and the leaven of Herod Antipas. This is at the time of Herod Antipas. Herod the Great has died when he was a baby. Jesus was a baby. And Herod Antipas has become the tetrarch. Sometimes we say king, but he wanted to be king. He never got to be king. And when he finally, I think it was 37 AD, when he and Herodias went to Rome and said, "You made Agrippa king, I want to be king too." And he caught Caesar on a bad hair day, and Caesar exiled him. He lost his kingdom. He'd been king since 4 BC or whatever that date is, the traditional date. He'd been king since Herod the Great died for a long, long time, and he got exiled for doing that. But anyway, so these people had their teachings. It's really interesting here. The Pharisees and the Herodians didn't get along at all. The people that were big followers of Herod, the different Herods, they didn't get along at all. But here, Jesus lumps them together. Their teaching is like being leavened. Well, the disciples do not understand what Jesus is saying. And they start saying, "Oh, we didn't bring bread with us, we don't have any bread." And Jesus goes, "We just had 2 miracles of feeding 5,000 and 4,000, and you're asking, we don't have any bread." He said, "Whoa." And so they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And when Stan sent this to me at the beginning, about the middle of the week, last night, Tuesday or Wednesday, I'm looking at, what in the world is this? I thought it was a piece of bread, a loaf of bread on some kind of board. It's a chalkboard. That's a piece of chalk. and that's what we had a big laugh over that. And so, anyway, so they'd forgotten to bring bread and had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And when he said this, and so they came to Bethesda, and that's why I showed you the map of Bethesda. Back to the archaeology, what happened was we didn't know where the city of Bethesda was. We had discovered Capernaum, we discovered Magdala, we discovered, of course, we knew where Tiberias was because the city was still there. They discovered just all the cities around the Sea of Galilee. But they weren't sure where Bethsaida was. And the Bethsaida, one scholar said, "I think it's here." And it was a place about 2 miles north, off the Sea of Galilee. And so people began saying, "Well, we know this is where Bethsaida was." And so what happened must have been that the Sea of Galilee has shrunk. It's smaller. They have now proven that was not the case. And that Bethsaida was right there. And so they dug in a place called Etel for a long time, but it just didn't fit. There was something that just didn't fit. And so now they're digging, and lo and behold, they found a church there with mosaics and all. They found what they believe. Again, this is still a little bit of guesswork, but one scholar, a couple of scholars believe they've actually found the home of Peter and James. And this very similar thing happened in Capernaum. Peter had moved to Capernaum. We're not sure if James had moved there too. He may still been at Bethsaida. But when you go to the archaeological site there at Capernaum, they'll show you a spaceship church. It looks like a spaceship that landed, and underneath that is the house of Simon Peter, where almost all scholars, liberal, conservative, whatever, believe this was actually where Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law. And then eventually, for a long, long time, there was no church over it, but eventually they built a church, and you go inside that church now, and you can look down into the house, or you can actually walk up to the house on the side and see it. But that'll be an interesting fine. But in the one in Bethsaida, now the place that we really believe is Bethsaida on the Sea of Galilee, where I showed you on the map, they actually began building. They actually began notice that what happened is people started treating that house like it's holy and built houses around it and kind of started the church in that house too. So it's going to be very, very anxious to find out what they found there. Anyway, so that's why I want to show you Bethsaida rather. And Jesus, unfortunately, we're having to move faster than we really want to through here. So we're not going to repeat the second feeding. Some very interesting things happened in that story too. But these people are coming from everywhere. That's why these crowds are so large. When it says 5,000 men, it also makes it very clear that's 5,000 males beside the wives and the children there. And 4,000 men, I think the same thing. So these are large crowds. And these crowds have come from all over the Decapolis, cities like Amman, Jordan, Jerash. There's a few cities on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, what he called Hippos, actually named after the Greek word for horse. And people from those areas, and the biggest city is the city just south. We always go there. It's called Beit Shan today. That was the ancient name, and now it's called Sycopolis. In the New Testament times, it was called Sycopolis. It was another Greek-speaking city. And these people were coming from all around to hear Jesus. So the crowds were, even though there are a lot of small villages here, Tiberias was of decent size, but there weren't really many large cities. West of that, the old capital of Herod Antipas, Zippori, or we know it Sepphoris, it became the Greek name for it, was several miles west. But people from all those areas, Cana, Nazareth, came to hear Jesus speak. And they would get out there on the grass, and it's hilly, but it's not real hilly on the northern side, but it is hilly. You have a lot of mounds there. So we can take you, we usually stop at the Church of the Beatitudes, and again, that's the traditional site, but there are 2 or 3 other mounds around that may be the right one. But I know several of you have been to that particular site there. But there are a lot of rolling hills, a lot of grass, and so these people would spread out over those places. But anyway, Jesus begins talking to his disciples about, the time is going to come. Now, when you read some of the Gospels, it's a while before you get there. If you start with Luke and Matthew, you're going to end up hearing about the birth narrative. You're going to hear about, in Matthew, the Magi. You're going to hear about Herod the Great trying to kill Jesus. When you read Luke, you're going to go to the shepherd fields, because he first appeared to the shepherds when Jesus was just a baby. Then, whatever it was, 6 months later, a year later, the Magi come. And so that's why one of our traditions, we've stuck them together in the scenes, but yet the two accounts were 2 different times. And so here you are in a lot of the gospel accounts. It's a while before you get to John the Baptist coming, but that's where Mark starts. He starts, through the eyes of Peter, and he starts with John the Baptist's preaching and Jesus coming along to preach. John in his gospel begins with pre-existence of Christ, 18 verses telling about the pre-existence. At the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and that he works his way down, and the Word became flesh in verse 14. And in the end of verse 18, you end up with that section, and the next thing you know, the Logos is turned into Jesus. And so there he is, and so there John the Baptist occurs. So it's a while in Luke and Matthew before you get to the preaching of John the Baptist and Jesus' ministry. It's not too long once you get past that 18-verse prologue then he jumps to teaching of John and Jesus. But Mark, that's where he starts out. This is the basic place where he starts. And before you know it, when you get to the 8th chapter, you've basically finished his 3-year ministry. Because the rest of Mark is going to deal with the events around Jerusalem and the crucifix of Jesus. So this Jesus is going to give them little hints, little pieces. He's going to say something about his crucifixion. And the disciples are going to look at each other like, oh, what's he talking about now? And so they're going to deal with it. So Jesus is going to, in chapter 8, which is, remember, if we were to divide Mark into 16 chapters, the first eight will be heavily concentrating on the Galilean ministry. And then we're going to suddenly have a lot of chapters dealing with the events around Jerusalem and the crucifixion of Jesus. So he's beginning to tell them how he must suffer and be rejected, bring in Old Testament scriptures to help understand that. So he says, if you really want to follow me, there's going to be hardship, there's going to be suffering, there's going to be resistance. And if you're going to take up your cross and follow me. And so it's a beautiful statement. So before you know it, he's in the transfiguration. Again, he's trying to teach these disciples who he really is. It did really come from God. You've seen miracles, he said. You've seen me handle the Sea of Galilee. You've seen me handle storm. You've seen me walk on water. And so they go to a tall mountain. Now, we don't know exactly where this mountain is. If you go to Jerusalem today, whoever your guide is, will probably say, if you go on top of Mount Tabor, we always have to make a choice. There are too many things to see. So we either choose Mount Tabor or Mount Carmel. Occasionally we've gone to both, but usually we don't go to both. So we started going to Mount Tabor more. Both are great sites to go to. You get to see a great view of the Valley of Jezreel. But if you go to Mount Tabor has this road that winds up, and there are no rails on the road, and it's curve after curve, and it's on one side of the mountain. You're going up, and when they drive up, what happens is your bus will only go to a certain point, and then you get off and you get in these taxis, these vans, and you have a different guide driving you. So they usually flew up the mountain. I mean, it went pretty fast. A little, again, it didn't make you too nervous, but there are no rails. And then they would come down slow. So I think when Juanita went with me on her second trip, I think it was, she hadn't been to the top of Mount Tabor, so we go up, and he goes pretty fast, and there's about 8 or 9 of us in the van. And I said, well, he'll slow down when he comes down. So he picks us back up after. And by the way, you have a church up there. And it's called the Church of the Transformation. The word transformation means to change forms. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So we're coming down the hill. I think the guy's name was Naeem. I think that's right. I've forgotten. But he was flying. And I said to him, at the end of each of those curves, they've got different flags sitting up. I said, Naeem, as the reason, are each one of those flags planted for somebody you guys have killed coming down the mountain? He laughed and said, no. He said, the flags are there to kind of warn us that they were coming to a curve and all of that. And they want us to go down fairly slow. But boss not here today. I said, Naeem, either you slow down or your tip is going to shrink to almost nothing. He slowed down. But he thought that was really funny. But 5 minutes. Okay, very good. So, uh, anyway, when the other place that a lot of people argue for, and with good reason, is there near Caesarea Philippi. When you're standing there, you can look and say, or if you're Dan, either one of those places, you're right next to Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon is a very impressive place, but it's kind of a mountain range more than a mountain. But some people believe that since Caesarea Philippi is there, and you have scenes of Jesus asking Peter, you know, who do people say that I am? And that whole discussion there. Others believe it's Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is 1,800 feet tall. It's actually, when you get on when you start up, you're below sea level, and then you go above sea level. So it's, you know, when you get up there, as you ride up there, you realize it's pretty high. And so since that was a traditional place, they built a church there called the Church of the Transformation. And you walk in, and there are, you even have a chapel for Moses, a chapel for Elijah. You have a main scene up there that you see, and then you have a wonderful place on top of the church building where you can look around. It's just really a gorgeous view up there. But this is one of the sites that people argue for, and your guide probably would say to you, this is probably the best site. When you go to Caesarea Philippi, for some reason, the guides never talk about it there. But anyway, so he's got these three, Peter, James, and John. James, of course, is the brother of Jesus. He's going to be killed in Acts chapter 12. He's going to be executed in Acts chapter 12 by Agrippa the First is going to do that. And in this transformation, of course, these three are again in shock. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to save a little time for us to begin here next week. But what happens is you have Moses that everybody knows, of course. Moses is the main character in the author and a main character, especially from Exodus on, but he wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy. And Moses is known as a prophet who was a lawgiver. He made a few predictions, didn't make a lot of predictions, but basically he was a skilled author, and no one has a higher status in the Old Testament outside God, of course, deity, than Moses. So his name is always extremely important. So he, the lawgiver of the Old Testament, appears. Elijah was a prophet who was, there were two different kind of prophets in the period of the kings. You had court prophets like Nathan. They were prophets who either lived in the palace or lived close by, and they could come and consult the king, and they gave him advice. And you had a second type prophet like the Elijahs and the Elishas, Elijah was kind of that wild man, and he was the one, and Jesus said, Malachi says he's going to, come ahead of the Messiah, and Jesus said, John the Baptist was the Elijah who was to come. Anyway, so you have two extremely important prophets. There, one, the lawgiver, the other, a major mouthpiece of God who fought against Ahab and Jezebel and all those kind of people. And so they appear with him. And so what we're going to do, we'll have a prayer in just a minute. What we're going to do is begin at that scene there, whether it was on Mount Tabor or whether it was on Mount Hermon or whatever. It does say a very, very high mountain. So it has to be someplace like that. So if you'll bow, we'll have a closing prayer. Our gracious, wonderful, giving, loving, caring Heavenly Father, we We thank you for Jesus who came to die for us. We thank you for his incredible teaching that helps guide our lives. We thank you for these stories about the disciples around him and what, as they were struggling and trying to learn about him. And we thank you that we're able to read these stories where he's dealing with them and answering their questions, trying to tell them what's really important and what's not important. So bless us this week. And dear God, we trust and pray that we'll see you again in this class next week, and Stan will be with me. And we pray for Stan and Cheryl on their trip. We pray for Joe McConnell with all the problems he's having. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for coming.